Hey guys. Tonight we begin with a man you probably met in elementary school. A man with 3 ships, a questionable sense of direction, and the confidence of someone who has absolutely not checked the math. So dim the lights, put your phone face down, get comfortable. Maybe imagine the gentle rocking of a wooden ship that smells faintly of tar and poor life choices. Tonight, we drift back to the 15th century, to a world of velvet hats, religious paranoia, and maps that looked like doodles during a boring sermon. And in the middle of it all, Christopher Columbus. Yes, that Christopher Columbus. The one with the holiday, the rhymes, the paintings where he stands heroically on a beach as if he personally invented sand. Let's float gently back to where he began. Christopher Columbus was born in 1451 in the Republic of Genoa, which is modern-day Italy. Not Spain, not America, just a busy little maritime city where everyone smelled like salt water and ambition. His father was a wool weaver, not a duke, not a prince, just a man trying to sell fabric in a city obsessed with ships. So already our future admiral of the ocean sea begins as a kid around looms. Young Christopher likely learned basic reading and writing, nothing fancy, no elite royal tutors whispering Latin poetry into his ear. He wasn't some glittering prodigy. He was practical, restless, and very interested in the sea. By his teenage years, he was already sailing. The Mediterranean was his classroom, and like many ambitious young men of his era, he absorbed ideas the way sailors absorbed scurvy. Now here's where things get cozy and strange. Christopher became obsessed with geography, or more accurately, his version of geography. He read the works of ancient writers like Ptolemy. He read Marco Polo's travel accounts about Asia. He also read some creative interpretations of the size of the Earth. And here's the gentle irony. Most educated people in the 15th century already knew the Earth was round. That wasn't the controversy. The debate wasn't flat versus round. It was, how big is this round thing? And Columbus, bless him, decided it was much smaller than it actually is. He underestimated the circumference of the Earth by a lot. He also overestimated how far east Asia extended, which meant that in his calculations, sailing west from Europe to reach Asia seemed doable. In reality, it was like planning a short jog and accidentally signing up for an ultramarathon across an ocean no one in Europe fully understood. But Columbus believed. Oh, he believed. He believed so confidently that he spent years trying to convince European monarchs to fund his voyage. And this is where we gently glide into the royal drama. He pitched his idea to Portugal first. King John II listened, probably nodded politely, and then had experts review the math. The experts essentially said no, because the numbers didn't add up, literally. So Portugal passed. Columbus did not take this as a sign to reconsider. Of course he didn't. He doubled down. Because why not double down when your calculations are wildly optimistic? He moved on to Spain. At the time, Spain had just finished the Reconquista, centuries of warfare ending with the conquest of Granada in 1492. The monarchs Ferdinand II of Aragon and Isabella I of Castile were fresh off a victory lap. Very Catholic, very ambitious, very interested in expanding influence. But even they hesitated. They had committees, more math, more delays. Columbus waited and waited for years. He negotiated aggressively. He didn't just want ships. He wanted titles. He wanted to be admiral of the ocean sea. He wanted to be viceroy of any lands he discovered. He wanted 10% of all profits, which is bold when you haven't actually discovered anything yet. Imagine asking for CEO benefits before the company exists. And yet, in 1492, they agreed. Why? Partly because they had just finished a war and needed new ventures, partly because Portugal was expanding along Africa and Spain didn't want to fall behind, and partly because, frankly, Columbus was persistent to the point of exhaustion. So they gave him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. None of them were luxury liners. They were small, wooden, creaky. The Santa Maria was the largest, and even that was modest, about the length of a tennis court. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera. Picture it. Wooden hulls pushing into open water, sailors who had signed up for pay, not immortality. Weeks of nothing but horizon, salt, wind, and the slow realization that maybe the Earth is bigger than advertised. The voyage was tense. The crew grew nervous. They had no idea what lay ahead. No GPS, no weather apps, just stars and stubbornness. Columbus kept 2 sets of logs, one with the real distance traveled, a slightly adjusted downward to make the crew think they hadn't gone quite as far, which is comforting in a slightly manipulative way. Eventually, on October 12, 1492, land was sighted, an island in the Bahamas. Columbus believed he had reached Asia, specifically islands near India, which is why he called the indigenous people he encountered Indians. He was wrong, but confidently wrong. The encountered were the Taino. They were not waiting for European arrival. They had their own societies, trade networks, and cultures. They were not background characters in someone else's epic. Columbus described them as gentle and generous. He also noted, quite casually, that they would make good servants. And here, the sleepy tone has to gently acknowledge something important. This was not a peaceful cultural exchange. Columbus's arrival marked the beginning of colonization, forced labor, and brutal exploitation in the Caribbean. He established settlements. He demanded gold. When gold was scarce, he imposed tribute systems. Punishments for failing to meet quotas were harsh. The Santa Maria ran aground on Christmas Day, 1492, so he left some men behind in a settlement called La Navidad, because nothing says holiday spirit like abandoning your crew in a fragile outpost. He returned to Spain as a hero, or at least as a man who had found land, people, and the possibility of wealth. Ferdinand and Isabella received him warmly. He paraded captives and exotic goods. He was granted his titles: Admiral, Viceroy. The second voyage in 1493 was much larger, 17 ships, over 1,000 men. This wasn't exploration anymore, this was colonization, and things unraveled quickly. The settlement he had left behind? Destroyed. The men? Dead. Relations with the Taino deteriorated. Violence escalated. Spanish settlers complained. Columbus struggled to govern. He was better at sailing west than managing people. Reports of cruelty reached Spain. Eventually, in 1500, a royal commissioner named Francisco Bobadilla was sent to investigate. He arrested Columbus, put him in chains, and sent him back to Spain. Yes, the admiral of the ocean sea returned home in irons, which is a surprisingly poetic image. He insisted on wearing the chains until they reached Spain, perhaps for drama, perhaps for principle, perhaps because he believed history would vindicate him. The monarchs eventually released him. They restored some honors, but removed his governorship. He made one more voyage, still searching for a route to Asia, still convinced he was close. He died in 1506, still believing he had reached the outskirts of Asia. He never fully grasped that he had stumbled upon continents unknown to Europe. Now, let's gently pause here, because Columbus is complicated. For centuries, he was celebrated as a bold explorer, a visionary, the man who discovered America. Statues went up, holidays were declared. But over time, historians re-examined records, letters, testimonies, the treatment of indigenous populations, the systems of forced labor. And the narrative shifted. He did not discover a new world. He encountered one already inhabited. He miscalculated the globe. He misidentified the lands. He governed poorly, and his voyages opened the door to centuries of colonization and suffering. And yet, he also undeniably changed global history. His voyages connected Europe and the Americas in what historians call the Columbian Exchange. Crops, animals, diseases, people, all moving between continents in ways that reshaped the planet. Potatoes to Europe, horses to the Americas, smallpox devastating indigenous communities, sugar transforming economies. The world became permanently entangled. So the truth about Christopher Columbus is not a bedtime fairy tale. He was ambitious, stubborn, skilled at self-promotion, wrong about geography, effective at securing royal backing, brutal in governance, monumental in consequence. Not a cartoon villain, not a flawless hero, just a 15th century man with sails, miscalculations, and a relentless need to prove himself right. And as we
All right, settle back in. Let the imaginary ocean return. Soft waves, a wooden deck that creaks in a rhythm that is almost soothing. Almost. When we left Christopher Columbus, he had already crossed the Atlantic once, claimed islands for Spain, and misidentified an entire hemisphere as Asia, which is impressive in its own way. Now we drift into what happened next, and this is where the vibe shifts from bold sailor with bad math to colonial governor who probably should not have been in charge of anything. After his triumphant return to Spain in 1493, Columbus was riding high. He had titles, he had royal favor, he had stories. He had a few bewildered captives who had never asked to be part of this narrative. Ferdinand and Isabella were pleased enough. Spain wanted wealth. Portugal was already building trade routes around Africa. No one wanted to be left behind in the global competition for spices and shiny things. So Columbus got his second voyage. And this was not a cute little exploratory trip. This was 17 ships, over 1,000 settlers, soldiers, priests, farmers, opportunists, the whole colonial starter pack. They left in September 1493. This time, Columbus didn't just want to explore, he wanted to establish permanent Spanish settlements, forts, towns, tribute systems, the works. When they arrived back in the Caribbean, they found the settlement of La Navidad destroyed. The men left behind were dead. Columbus concluded that the local Taino had killed them. It's likely the Spanish men had mistreated local communities because that pattern was already emerging. The exact details are debated, but the mood was no longer friendly curiosity. Instead of reassessing anything, Columbus responded with force. He established a new settlement called La Isabela on the island of Hispaniola. It was meant to be Spain's shining foothold in the New World. It did not go smoothly. The settlers were miserable. The climate was harsh, supplies were short, disease spread, food ran low. The dream of easy gold evaporated quickly. And here's where we gently observe something very human. Most of the settlers had not signed up to farm in tropical heat. They had imagined gold lying casually on beaches. They had imagined immediate wealth. Instead, they found mosquitoes. Columbus, meanwhile, was obsessed with finding gold. He imposed a tribute system on the Taino. Every adult over a certain age was required to bring a set amount of gold dust every few months. If they complied, they received a token, a small copper tag worn around the neck. If they did not comply, punishments could be brutal. Hands were reportedly cut off. Violence became routine. This was not a misunderstanding. It was policy. And here, the sleepy tone has to carry something heavy without turning dramatic. The system devastated local communities. The Taino population declined rapidly. Violence, forced labor, malnutrition, and disease all played a role. Within decades, their numbers had collapsed catastrophically. Columbus may not have invented brutality, but he administered it. Meanwhile, Spanish settlers began complaining about him. Because here's the ironic twist. Columbus was harsh not only toward indigenous people, he was also harsh toward his own men. He punished dissent. He ruled rigidly. He seemed convinced that authority required constant intimidation. Some colonists felt he and his brothers, yes, he had installed his brothers in positions of power, were mismanaging the colony. Favoritism, poor distribution of supplies, heavy-handed discipline. Whispers traveled back to Spain. Now, Ferdinand and Isabella were ambitious monarchs, but they were also pragmatic. They cared about results. They cared about control. And they did not like chaos that made the crown look incompetent. So, in 1500, they sent Francisco de Bobadilla to investigate. Bobadilla arrived in Hispaniola and quickly gathered testimony from settlers. What he heard was not flattering. He arrested Columbus and his brothers, confiscated their property, and sent them back to Spain in chains. It's almost cinematic, the once celebrated admiral crossing the Atlantic again, but this time bound. Columbus reportedly insisted on wearing the chains even after they could have been removed during the voyage. He may have seen himself as a martyr, a misunderstood visionary betrayed by petty rivals. When he arrived in Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella had the chains removed. They restored some of his wealth and titles, but they did not restore his governorship. That chapter was over. And here's where Columbus becomes almost stubbornly tragic. He still believed he had reached Asia. He still believed there was a strait, a narrow passage, somewhere in the lands he had encountered that would lead directly to the riches of China and India. So, in 1502, he launched a fourth voyage. He was aging now, weathered, no longer the fresh-faced dreamer of 1492, but still driven. This voyage was difficult. Storms battered his ships. He explored parts of Central America, modern-day Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, and Panama. He encountered indigenous societies far more complex than those of the Caribbean islands. At one point, he heard of a powerful civilization inland. He was tantalizingly close to the Pacific Ocean, but he did not cross the isthmus. He did not see the vast ocean beyond. Instead, he continued searching for a mythical passage to Asia. His ships became worm-eaten and unseaworthy. He was stranded in Jamaica for nearly a year. Supplies dwindled. Morale sank. In a moment that feels oddly theatrical, Columbus used his knowledge of an upcoming lunar eclipse to impress and intimidate local leaders to provide food. He warned them that his god would darken the moon if they did not cooperate. When the eclipse occurred, as predicted, it must have seemed like cosmic validation. Even stranded, he leaned into performance. Eventually, rescue arrived. He returned to Spain in 1504. By then, Queen Isabella was dying, and without her, Columbus's strongest advocate at court was gone. He spent his final years petitioning for restoration of his full titles and privileges. He believed he had been wronged. He believed history would remember him differently. He died in 1506 in Valladolid, Spain. Still convinced he had reached Asia, still arguing over contractual rights. He was not a wealthy conqueror in his final days, not destitute, but not triumphant either, more like a man still drafting emails to a monarchy that had moved on. And meanwhile, the world he had set in motion was transforming rapidly. So let's gently zoom out. In 1494, just 2 years after his first voyage, Spain and Portugal signed the Treaty of Tordesillas. With papal approval, they drew an imaginary line down the Atlantic, dividing newly discovered lands between them. Because nothing says global diplomacy than drawing a line across an ocean you barely understand. That line would shape centuries of colonization. Portugal would claim Brazil, Spain would dominate much of the rest of the Americas. Other European powers watched carefully: England, France, the Netherlands. Columbus had proven that crossing the Atlantic was possible. The map was no longer theoretical. Soon, other explorers followed, some searching for gold, some for trade routes, some for land, some for glory, most for profit. The age of exploration expanded into conquest. And here's the quiet irony that historians love to point out. Columbus was not the first European to reach the Americas.
Norse explorers like Leif Erikson had reached parts of North America centuries earlier, but those voyages did not spark sustained contact. Columbus's did. Not because he was uniquely brilliant, not because he fully understood what he had done, but because his voyages occurred at a moment when European monarchies had the resources, ambition, and bureaucratic machinery to follow through. Timing is everything. Now, let's talk about reputation. For centuries, Columbus was celebrated as a heroic discoverer. In the United States, especially during the 19th century, he became a symbol of ambition and perseverance. Italian-American communities embraced him as a cultural icon. Statues were erected. Columbus Day became a federal holiday in 1937. But in recent decades, his legacy has been fiercely debated. Many historians and activists argue that celebrating Columbus ignores the suffering that followed his arrival. Indigenous communities have emphasized the catastrophic consequences of colonization: forced labor, displacement, disease, cultural destruction. Some cities and states now observe Indigenous Peoples' Day instead. Statues have been removed or vandalized, and so Columbus exists in modern memory as something complicated. Not the brave cartoon explorer in elementary school plays, not a single-dimensional villain either, but a man whose actions triggered vast, irreversible change. Let's gently sit with that. He was ambitious, he was resilient, he was also ruthless. He was shaped by his era's religious fervor and economic hunger. He believed expansion was justified. He believed he had divine favor. He miscalculated geography. He misjudged people.
All right, let's ease into the final stretch. The ocean is calmer now. The ships are long gone. Christopher Columbus himself has been buried, reburied, moved, debated over, and politely argued about for centuries. Because if there's one thing Columbus managed to do after death, it's stay controversial. When he died in 1506, he was not the towering legend we sometimes imagine. He was a complicated former governor who had fallen out of favor. He was still negotiating with the Spanish crown over money and titles. His son, Diego Columbus, would continue those legal battles, insisting the family deserved the privileges originally promised. And the crown, being the crown, responded in the most royal way possible, with slow, grinding legal ambiguity. But while Columbus's personal legacy was being sorted out in courtrooms, something bigger was happening. The Spanish Empire was expanding. Men like Hernán Cortés would topple the Aztec Empire. Francisco Pizarro would conquer the Inca. Entire civilizations were reshaped under Spanish rule. Columbus had not conquered vast mainland empires himself. He never saw Tenochtitlan. He never stood in Cusco. But he opened the Atlantic door, and once it was open, it did not close. Spain grew immensely wealthy from American silver, especially from mines like Potosi. Europe's economy shifted, trade networks expanded, the Atlantic world replaced the Mediterranean as the center of gravity, and Columbus became gradually a symbol. Now here's where things get softly ironic. In the 16th century, Columbus was important, yes, but he was not universally glorified. He was one explorer among many. Amerigo Vespucci had his own voyages, and it was Vespucci's name that ended up on the maps. America, not Columbia. Cartographers like Martin Waldseemüller labeled the new continents after Vespucci, believing he recognized them as a new world distinct from Asia. Columbus, who never quite accepted that fact, did not get naming rights, which feels like the ultimate historical irony. You cross the ocean, you miscalculate the globe, you insist you've reached Asia, and then someone else gets the continent named after them. History can be petty like that. But fast forward a few centuries. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in the newly formed United States, Columbus experienced a rebrand. The young republic was looking for origin stories that felt less British, less tied to monarchy. Columbus, conveniently, was Italian, sailed under Spain, and represented bold exploration rather than colonial governance. He became a symbol of courage, of initiative, of discovering a new world. Poets wrote about him. Paintings depicted him standing nobly on Caribbean shores, flag raised, gazing into destiny. Never mind the actual complexities, the paintings were very flattering. In 1792, on the 300th anniversary of his first voyage, celebrations were held. By the late 1800s, statues were going up in American cities. And here's another layer. For Italian-American communities in the United States, Columbus became a powerful cultural symbol. At a time when Italian immigrants faced discrimination, Columbus offered a connection to national pride. The narrative went, "We gave you the man who discovered America." In 1937, under President Franklin D. Roosevelt, Columbus Day became a federal holiday. And for decades, that was the dominant story. Schoolchildren learned rhymes. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It was tidy, easy, digestible. But history, like the Atlantic, rarely stays calm forever. By the late 20th century, historians and indigenous activists began pushing back more forcefully against the heroic narrative. Primary sources, Columbus's own letters, administrative records, testimonies from settlers, had always existed. They described forced labor systems, brutal punishments, enslavement. What changed was public willingness to engage with those documents. The suffering of the Taino and other indigenous peoples became central to the conversation. The demographic collapse of Caribbean populations after European contact was re-examined. Disease, exploitation, violence, all acknowledged more openly. And so Columbus's image shifted again. Statues that once symbolized exploration became flashpoints. Some were removed, some were toppled during protests, others were defended passionately. In many U.S. cities and states, Columbus Day has been replaced or supplemented with Indigenous Peoples Day, a reframing meant to honor the cultures that existed long before 1942. And here's where we slow down, because the truth about Christopher Columbus is not a simple swap from hero to villain. He was not uniquely monstrous for his time. Many European explorers and colonizers behaved with similar brutality. He operated within a system driven by empire, wealth extraction, and religious justification. But that does not erase the consequences of his actions. He initiated forced labor systems on Hispaniola. He sanctioned violence. He transported enslaved indigenous peoples across the Atlantic. His governance contributed to suffering on a massive scale. He also demonstrated extraordinary persistence, navigational skill, political savvy in securing royal backing. He crossed an ocean that many feared. Both realities coexist, and that coexistence makes bedtime history slightly uncomfortable, but not dramatic, just layered. Let's gently consider the broader ripple. The Columbian Exchange, that vast transfer of plants, animals, microbes, and people, reshaped the globe. European diets changed with the arrival of potatoes and tomatoes. American landscapes changed with horses and cattle. African populations were devastated by the transatlantic slave trade, which grew as indigenous labor declined. The modern world, its economies, its demographics, its cuisines, is deeply entangled with the consequences of 1492. Columbus did not foresee that. He was searching for spices and gold. He thought he was skirting the edges of Asia. He never imagined a new world civilization emerging centuries later. History often moves beyond the intentions of the people who start it. And Columbus, in the end, was very human, ambitious, deeply religious, stubborn to the point of delusion, capable of charisma and cruelty, skilled at self-promotion, bad at administration, obsessed with status. He believed God had chosen him for a divine mission. He believed Asia was just over the horizon. He believed his contracts with the crown guaranteed him permanent authority. He was wrong about several of those things, but he was right about one. The ocean could be crossed. As we drift into the final quiet minutes of our story, imagine him again. Not the statue, not the painting, just the aging sailor on the deck of a worm-eaten ship near Jamaica, watching the moon darken in an eclipse he knew was coming. He lifts his eyes, the crew watches him, the local leaders watch him. For a moment, he appears almost prophetic, but it's just astronomy. That feels like a fitting image. A man using knowledge, ambition, and timing to shape perception. A man standing between worlds, misunderstanding both. After his death, his remains were moved several times, from Spain to the Caribbean, possibly back again. Even his bones became part of the transatlantic story. Debates continue over where he is actually buried. Spain? The Dominican Republic? Both claim him. Even in death, he straddles continents, which feels appropriate. The truth about Christopher Columbus is not clean. It is not tidy. It does not fit neatly into a children's rhyme or a single protest sign. He did not discover an empty land. He did not prove the earth was round. He did not reach Asia. He did not peacefully trade beads and sail home. He did cross the Atlantic 4 times. He did initiate sustained European contact with the Americas. He did enforce brutal systems. He did change world history. And maybe the most honest way to remember him is not as a marble statue or a villainous caricature, but as a reminder that exploration and exploitation often traveled together, that ambition can open doors and unleash suffering, that myths are built slowly, layer by layer, until they feel solid, and then, sometimes, they are gently examined again. So let the Atlantic finally grow still. The sails are lowered, the arguments are quieter now, the statues stand or fall, depending on the city, the holiday shifts names in some places, the textbooks grow more nuanced. And somewhere in the 15th century twilight, a Genoese sailor squints at the horizon, absolutely certain that Japan is just a little farther west. Still confident, still wrong, and